History as it happens, May 11th, 2023. Khrushchev's gamble, Putin's hubris.
This sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country.
There has been no confrontation as far as we know, and some hope has been generated by suggestions of negotiation.
Ambassador Zorin denied that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba. Yes or no?
The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war.
President Putin has made overt nuclear threats against Europe and a reckless disregard for the responsibilities of the non-proliferation regime.
Russia's president is exploiting the patriotic vibes from the Soviet victory over the Nazis to justify his forever war in Ukraine. But maybe there's a better history lesson for Vladimir Putin to apply here. Not 1945, but 1962, when a Soviet autocrat rolled the dice in his confrontation with the West and brought the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. That's next as we resurrect the Cuban Missile Crisis, as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Russia is celebrating what's known as Victory Day today. The event marks the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие ветераны, товарищи солдаты и матросы, сержанты и старшины.
This nation is opposed to war. We are also true to our word. Our unswerving objective, therefore, must be to prevent the use of these missiles against this or any other country, and to secure their withdrawal or elimination from the Western Hemisphere.
Under brilliant sunshine in Red Square, before row after row of 8,000 perfectly attired soldiers, Vladimir Putin delivered his annual speech marking Russia's most important holiday, May 9th, Victory Day, the Soviet Union, having lost something like 25 million of its citizens, finally vanquished the Nazis.
Поздравляю вас с праздником, с Днем Победы. С праздником в честь наших отцов, дедов и прадедов.
There was indeed much to commemorate. The fighting on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 45 defies the imagination. But Russia's autocrat used the occasion to once more perversely distort history in memory. In a relatively subdued address compared to his past pronouncements about the current war, Putin promised Russia would continue fighting to rid Ukraine of torturers, death squads, and Nazis. It's not clear how many Russian citizens find this comparison convincing. What's more clear is that Putin does not appear ready to back out of his disastrous blunder initiated in February 2022. If Putin really is a student of history, as he sees himself anyway, he seems to be overlooking a valuable lesson from the Soviet past, when Nikita Khrushchev, after a reckless gamble during some of the coldest years of the Cold War, stepped back from the brink. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended on October 28, 1962, 6 days after President Kennedy stunned the American public with news that Khrushchev had tried to sneak nuclear missiles into Cuba.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
Now imagine the shock. I mean, just think how you might react if you found out tomorrow that China had spent the prior several months building missile sites in Mexico. Not a great analogy, but you get my point. Well, fortunately for humanity, on October 26th, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba again. And the U.S. would also agree to remove its nukes that were pointing at the Soviet Union from Turkey.
General, I just wanted to bring you up to date on this matter because I know of your concern about it. We got, Friday night, got a message from Khrushchev, which said that he would withdraw these missiles and technicians and so on, providing we did not plan to invade Cuba. We then got a message, that public one, the next morning, in which he said he would do that if we withdrew our missiles from Turkey.
And that was Kennedy on the phone with Eisenhower seeking some advice. During those 13 days in October, the U.S. and USSR came very close to war. We now know from the XCOM tapes that on October 16th, day one of the crisis, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, sitting at a table with Kennedy and his civilian and military advisors, suggested attacking Cuba immediately to take out the missiles.
We could carry out an airstrike within a matter of days. We would be ready for the start of such an airstrike within a matter of days. If it were absolutely essential, it could be done almost literally within a matter of hours.
And as historians Sergey Radchenko and Vladislav Zubok detail in a superb essay in Foreign Affairs, headlined Blundering on the Brink, based on newly declassified Soviet documents, Khrushchev's gamble was plagued by a series of mishaps, comical if they weren't so potentially disastrous, mishaps and miscalculations. They'll join us in a moment to discuss what they call the unlearned lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis that can be applied to the war in Ukraine today. The unknowns, the misperceptions about your foe, the role of pure luck in avoiding catastrophe, the unpredictable nature of war, of escalation. After throwing the dice one too many times, Khrushchev did wake up to these realities. As he himself put it afterward, the two most powerful nations had been squared off against each other, each with its finger on the button. You'd have thought that war was inevitable, but both sides showed that if the desire to avoid war is strong enough, even the most pressing dispute can be solved by compromise. Now, we need to be careful not to take the comparison too far between 1962 and today. But there is something to it. Vladimir Putin apparently still believes he can win, and as we know, he has threatened to use nukes if necessary. In the West, there are plenty of commentators who dismiss such talk as empty bluster, who believe Russia can be defeated totally without risking nuclear war. As if anyone can be so certain. Wars rarely, if ever, go the way the combatants expect, and that goes for both sides in this terrible conflict in Ukraine. Thus, Kennedy and Khrushchev have something to teach us. Step back before something crazy happens. Remember, on October 27, 1962, as negotiations seemed to be getting somewhere, a U.S. reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, and then in the Caribbean, U.S. warships dropped depth charges on either side of a Soviet submarine to force it to the surface. What the Americans did not know at the time was the sub was carrying a nuclear weapon, and believing a war had started, the Soviets prepared to launch. Fortunately for planet Earth, a Soviet officer refused to greenlight that launch. Sergey Radchenko is a historian at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Vladislav Zubok is a historian at the London School of Economics and Political Science. They are both experts on Soviet and Cold War history, and I'm thrilled they're here to talk about their essay in Foreign Affairs and much more. Sergey Radchenko, welcome to the podcast.
Martin, great to be here.
And same to you, Vlad Zubok.
Good to be here, Martin.
Both joining me from London. So you wrote this fascinating essay in Foreign Affairs, which is the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. You wrote, at a time of escalating tensions with another brash leader in the Kremlin, the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis offers a chilling message about the risks of brinksmanship. And it also illustrates the degree to which the difference between catastrophe and peace often comes down not to considered strategies, but to pure chance. Why don't we just start with you, Sergey? Explain what you meant there.
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a moment of high danger during the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States came to the very brink of nuclear catastrophe. That's why this is a period that historians return to again and again and again, and policymakers like to talk about as well. But it also is a part of public imagination about the Cold War, right? That moment where we were at the brink. Now, how real is this? Of course it's real. It was extremely dangerous. What we know today is that we were simply lucky to survive.
Yeah, Vlad, we often overlook luck when we talk about statecraft because we want to think that we're in control of things and that we're brilliant statesmen can solve problems.
Well, I think ancient Romans knew something about luck because before any major battle, they had a whole religious ritual. They prayed to gods, not only Romans, everyone, because they knew that luck decides the fate of the battle, along with structure, along the size of your forces, along the terrain. It may rain, it may be sunny, and all the way to Clausewitz. I think von Clausewitz put it very well. Any statesman who goes into something, and let's assume Khrushchev sends missiles to Cuba, he has to think about three things: how to mobilize this force, how to deliver this force, how to organize it, but also this French expression coup d'oeil. That is, you have to react to local terrain, unforeseen consequences, chance, accidents. And Khrushchev really was amazing at ignoring all of this advice by Clausewitz, as well as ancient Romans, I should say.
I want to return to what's going on in Ukraine today and how to apply the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis to it. But maybe just one more point about current day affairs. In the New York Times today, an op-ed by Timothy Snyder, who's a historian but very pro-Ukraine in his writings, and there's nothing wrong with being pro-Ukraine, but I think some of his analysis slides into the area of propaganda. He's writing that we forget nuclear powers have lost wars. He's basically saying we continue to overestimate Russia's strength, and basically what he's saying is don't worry about all this bluster about nuclear weapons. I mean, can we dismiss it that easily?
I can weigh in on this. I think Timothy Snyder is right to say that nuclear powers have lost wars, the United States in Vietnam, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. But here's something to remember. Nuclear powers have not lost wars that they define as existential for themselves. And that is where it becomes extremely tricky because so much depends on your perception. You might say, well, what Russia is doing in Ukraine today is by no stretch of imagination existential war for Russia. It may be existential for Ukraine, but not for Russia. Therefore, Russia will not resort to nuclear weapons. But how do we know that? When people say that, my question to them is, how do we know this? How can we get inside of Putin's brain and definitively say that he's not considering a nuclear war over what his red lines may be, so-called red lines, whether it's Crimea, whether it's something else? We simply don't know. There is an element of uncertainty here, and that is an uncertainty that should give us a pause, given the stakes involved, tremendous stakes involved, given that a nuclear war would lead to unimaginable losses. We have to be exceptionally careful today, just as Kennedy and Khrushchev turned out to be in the end during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's right, Vlad. As Sergey just said, wars can take on a life of their own and then become existential. And in Russia's mind, at least based on what Putin and his ruling circles say publicly, this is all about Russia's survival.
Well, I talked to many Russians, and some of them are not thrilled by what is going on. And some of them even dare to say that was a dreadful mistake. But then they quickly add that what is the exit from this war for us? And ironically, what you read in Western academic press, not only academic, is that, for instance, the war in Afghanistan, people assume in the United States, led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Imagine that, limited war. Well, no, it was not true. Sergey is shaking the hand. I see him. We know it's not true. But, you read this kind of story that links even the loss of a limited regional war to the final collapse of the empire or the final collapse of your state. And you begin to think, what will happen to Mother Russia or to Russian state now if Putin loses these battles in Ukraine? And you have, again, returning to what many Russians actually are capable of hearing and listening through internet and others, they hear the story that there are many, many actors in Eastern Europe in particular, but also in the UK and the United States, who are eager to finish off Russia for good, to solve the Russian problem by decolonizing Russia, dismembering it as one state, and so on and so forth. So what do you expect? Then you raise the question, yes, waging this war is a horrible thing, but losing this war may be even worse.
I would just echo what Vlad was saying there. There is a perception that the war in Afghanistan led to the Soviet collapse. I wonder where it comes from. Sometimes, you have this public perceptions out there that have absolutely no basis in reality in no conceivable way. It's a reminder that The Cold War, a period that is relatively recent, actually, is something that is already full of myths and stories that people internalize and draw lessons, often incorrect lessons, on that basis. And it's just a reminder to us historians how important it is to continue researching the Cold War period, investigating those crises, as Vlad and I did in this article in Foreign Affairs.
I'm just astonished that people would draw the wrong lessons from history, let me just say. So maybe we'll return to what's going on today at the end of the interview. Let's talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis then. What struck me about it was unknowns. It's a reminder that each side in any conflict, especially that one, cannot be entirely sure of what the other side is doing at any given time or why they're doing it. What might appear as an offensive measure, i.e. placing missiles in Cuba, was actually done from the Soviet perspective as a defensive or a deterrent measure to stop another U.S. invasion of Cuba. I mean, that kind of misreading of the opponent seems impossible to avoid, but it doesn't stop people from proclaiming that they know exactly what's going on, right?
Well, that's exactly right. Late Bob Jervis had long talked about this, the existence of misperceptions in international relations, international politics. And you do have a mismatch between what the United States believe the Soviets are doing and what the Soviets are doing. But here's an interesting thing as well. We're sometimes prone to say that decisions are made for one reason. What's interesting about the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you think about Khrushchev's decision-making, you'll see that he made his decision to place missiles in Cuba for a number of reasons. You mentioned the defense of Cuba. That is certainly an important reason that he sent missiles there. Another important reason was that he felt that the Soviet Union was in an unequal position because the Americans had missiles in Turkey and also in Italy, and he felt that this would be a way to equalize the situation or to show that the Soviet Union was a co-equal superpower. He may have had a number of considerations, and his mind, perhaps even the hierarchy of those causes, was not very clear. So early on, the Americans were trying to figure this out. You actually can see this from XCOM transcripts, and we don't talk about it in the article, but it's very well known. XCOM was, of course, the committee that Kennedy pulled together to consider what to do about the missiles. But you have them, engaging this guesswork. Why did he do that? Is it because of Berlin? Is it because of this? Is it because of that? And often they were completely wrong, which just shows, you can see in reality, live, so to speak, as the two sides are misreading one another. And that, of course, is something that can lead to very dangerous outcomes.
Vlad, why did Khrushchev think he could even get away with it? Still astounding to this day is that he thought no one would notice, or they wouldn't be noticed right away because of palm trees?
Well, before I get to the palm trees, as Sergey was speaking, I was thinking how often this misreading of the opponent's mind comes from the strength of your own perspective. Americans are much stronger in creating strategies, writing out doctrines. There's amazing disparity between the Soviet documents on how the Soviets wanted to wage the Cold War and American documents. In American documents, you can train your students, you can train the military, intelligence officers, hundreds of pages and beautiful, beautiful prose, very logical, very detailed, point A, point B. So what Sergey actually said comes, more from American perspective, from Graham Allison's book, The Essence of the Decision. Yeah, we know that for Khrushchev, it was impulse. It was impulsive. What was the first impulse? Sergey and I know very well that it was Cuba. He was thinking about how to protect Cuba against the next American invasion. He had no doubt that Kennedy would send another expedition, let's put it mercenaries or Contras or help, this time backed by the CIA, and what Khrushchev could do to prevent the fall of Cuba. That was the original impulse. Then comes all other things that normally are listed just one after another in a sort of laundry list sequence. Then comes the idea of the missiles and turning Cuba into a missile base. Then comes the idea of, by the way, showing the United States that we, the Soviets, can do to them what they had been doing to us. So all of this is a corollary of this first impulse. What I'm about to say is that Soviet decision-making was either murky as it was under Stalin. You never can truly find the train of thought for Stalin. It simply is not recorded, or it's impulsive. With Khrushchev, everyone records he's impulsive. He gets this idea, and he likes this idea, and then he begins to move like a tank. His right-hand man, Mikoyan, used this expression. He moves like a tank. It's impossible to stop him. So that impossibility to stop Khrushchev with any reasons, with any kind of, oh, but what if, brings up the palm trees, and the palms happen to be, something that was mentioned by Marshal Biruzov, who was not even a rocket man. He was appointed to the post of the top missile commander, transferred from the artillery. The artillery can be hidden somehow, but missiles, sorry, they're too big to be hidden. He had one and only trip to Cuba, and he said it's possible to conceal huge missiles, really 25 meters behind the palm trees. That was nonsense. But when the military thought that Khrushchev was doing it, they never thought about it, of course, by themselves. But then they realized that Khrushchev had this idea. They realized what a great idea, we'll have this base under the American nose, and it would equalize our chances. And they squashed any opportunity for anyone, including the well-informed military attaché, Dementiev, who spent some time in Cuba, and he knew the terrain, squashed him when he tried to say, well, listen, it will not work. The U-2 reconnaissance flight will discover these missiles. Indeed, you have a case, the impulsive leader makes a decision, and no one contradicts. And moreover, people kind of bandwagon on this decision and try to cheer the leader on. Let's go in this direction, despite horrible gaps of knowledge. And
that was something that was astonishing about your essay. The Soviets didn't know anything about Cuba. Very little. And as you said, the first guy who came up with this idea or said it was possible to do it, well, later on there was reconnaissance there. They sent back the message to Moscow, Vlad, that you can't do this, but no one wanted to listen to that, right?
Well, we struggled, Sergey remembers, we struggled how to define it. What is that? And, when we checked Graham Allison's canonical book, the iconic book that is used by all political science, international relations classes to this day, there the explanation was that the Soviet military just acted by the book. They didn't change their instructions. Even when they arrived to Cuba, they just were told to act on your instructions. And we found it was not at all that way. They were very flexible. They reacted to the new situation. They immediately signaled to Moscow, wait a minute, this terrain is absolutely not good for camouflage. And they were ignored. And the most obvious reason for the Soviet bureaucracy was, we don't need your feedback anymore. The general staff made the decision, follow the guidelines.
That's the key thing, and that's the key argument that we put forward in the article, that the problem really with the Soviet military structure, but also political structure, is that there is no feedback mechanism. This information simply does not go back up to the top leadership, whether it's military leadership or whether it's political leadership. And as a result, a bad decision taking at the top then leads to terrible disasters down the road.
I think it's a matter of culture to a certain extent, almost. It took Germans to reach Stalingrad for the military to dare to tell Stalin that, hey, the situation the situation is such, you cannot do this. Listen to the military. And Stalin began to listen to the military. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I guess this situation developed so rapidly that the military never had a chance to do the same. Fortunately for us, but maybe.
Yeah, well, you mentioned how Khrushchev was feeling humiliation, right? One of his impulses was try to reverse that, tired of the Soviet Union being humiliated by the United States. That's a theme that I've picked up in my readings of Russian history. You can see it today with Putin, right? Trying to reverse the humiliation of the collapse of the Soviet Union post-1991. He wants Russia to continue to be a major power. Seems like Khrushchev was thinking similarly.
If I may, there's an emotional aspect to this, and there's a calculating aspect to this. In emotional terms, Khrushchev, as Vlad said, was extremely impulsive and also took offense easily. So one of his driving motivations and driving concerns throughout the Cold War was this sense that he was being humiliated by the United States. He just dreaded humiliation. He was trying to prove to the United States, but also to the world, to the international communist movement, where he had jealous Chinese who were watching him and were claiming his title for leadership in that international communist movement. He was trying to prove that, no, he could not be humiliated. Therefore, he would have to pursue a tough policy. And I would say that this emotional aspect also drives Putin, this concern about being humiliated by the United States. It's not a new thing. I mean, you can go years and even decades. Recently, in one of my classes, I actually had to go back to some of the early Putin speeches. And lo and behold, I discovered great consistency with what he's saying now. So this is a guy who's consistently just feels that he's been insulted by the West, or that the West is out to lecture him. And this is actually something that extends all the way back to Khrushchev and even before that to Stalin. You can see great consistency in the way that Soviet and Russian leaders approach foreign policy. But I would say there's also a calculating aspect here. The calculating aspect especially applies to Putin, for whom this discourse of humiliation, this whole narrative of humiliation, is tightly bound up with a projection of legitimacy, because he's trying to tell to the Russian public that, look, we are rejecting Western humiliation. We're standing up from our knees. This is something that Putin said very early on in his reign, when everybody in the West still thought that he was a nice liberal Democrat.
But Vlad, you were saying there was really no overarching Soviet strategic doctrine at work here? Or maybe there was, but it's hard to tell what it may have been because you have the whim of the leader in this case when it comes to Cuba.
Well, Martin, there was an overarching desire, I would say, that was even expressed in the party program, the communist program, about the same time, shortly before the Cuban Missile Crisis, to catch up and surpass the United States. And that was on the minds of all Soviet, military, all Soviet officials, the society. That was the main motivational factor to mobilize people to construct communism. And I think in the military affairs, that was an unusual era, that because of certain confluency of factors, the Soviet Union was making rapid progress in certain types of weaponry. The Soviet Union was always lagging behind in electronics disastrously, in communications, and tons of other things behind the United States that was much more developed, had more resources. But because of concentration of resources on missiles and nukes, the Soviet Union finally could achieve something totally extraordinary. It could equal the chances of mutual destruction, as this term later came up. And Khrushchev, he was absolutely fascinated by nuclear weapons. He saw nuclear weapons as something that happens once in your lifetime, maybe never again, both a chance to achieve this victory for communism globally, to convince the United States to stay out and desist and to be deterred, and protect Cuba and, if it works, some other countries in the world. So it was a great experiment for him, and I think psychologically was so irresistible. But Sergey raised a very, very insightful point. I mean, you go back to Stalin, Khrushchev, and Putin. What do they have in common? Extremely humble origins. Khrushchev famously compared himself to a Ukrainian character from a Ukrainian novel, Pina, who was a guy of low stature, absolutely no one, whom everybody despised. And then in the story, he comes out a hero. He leads everyone else. And that was a role model of Khrushchev, strangely enough, from this little-known story. Putin comes from the slums of Leningrad, and again, by chance, he becomes the head of a superpower, nuclear superpower. Anyone's head would get dizzy over it. He played it very safely at first, but gradually that took over him. That swelled his head, I think.
I don't think Putin is impulsive, although maybe February of 2022 he acted impulsively, but I'm not even convinced that was an impulsive move either. We'll maybe return to that in a little bit. So Khrushchev believes putting nuclear missiles in Cuba as a deterrent. From reading your essay and from what I can tell based on my somewhat limited understanding of Soviet history and this episode in history, neither he or anyone else raised the possibility that, this might actually trigger a nuclear war. Sure, we think of it as a deterrent, but the other side might not see it the way we see it.
Yeah, Khrushchev was a gambler. He would
quite a gamble.
No, it wasn't the first time. The first time, I think, was probably 1956 during the Suez Crisis. At that time, Khrushchev made an ultimatum to the British and the French, who were just waging a war against Egypt, that he might use nuclear weapons. Oh, and that was just a bluff. He would never have used nuclear weapons in that particular crisis. But after the French and the British pulled out and the crisis was over, Khrushchev concluded, as I think Vlad would agree, and he knows the story very well and has written about it, but Khrushchev concluded that this was very successful. This was great. So therefore, he continued then in 1957 in the Syrian crisis, in 1958, starting from 1958 with the series of Berlin ultimatums. He thought that it was worth it. But, it's interesting. At the height of the Berlin crisis, and, I'll explain how this connects to the height of the Berlin crisis, in 1961, Khrushchev had a discussion at the Politburo about the chances of war. At that time, just to remind you, he was trying to push the Americans out of West Berlin. And he talked about the chances of war. And he said something like, the chances of war are 5%. Where does he get this? Where did he get this number from? From the roof, from the wall? It was completely off, just random number, which is very interesting. But it betrays a gambler's mentality. Imagine you're a gambler and you're at a slot machine, and the chances of you winning are 95%. You would say, "Oh yeah, I'm in for this gamble." You'll go in. Of course, the problem is once he actually gets in, he realizes the 5% is not a guaranteed outcome. He thinks, well, after all, maybe this is it's a completely made up number. Maybe it's 50%. And this is where it becomes much more scary.
Yeah, there was always some level of collective decision-making with the Politburo with Khrushchev, right? But it doesn't seem like there was a lot of pushback about this idea.
Yeah, well, again, I should follow up on what Sergey said. The era before the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have to, and I teach many years I've been teaching the Cold War now, and I always tell the Cuban Missile Crisis was the defining moment when people realized you cannot just go to the brink for the sake of going to the brink. Right? So if we look down from the Cuban Missile Crisis, we see the road to détente. If we look at the preceding years, all the way from Hiroshima, basically, and from, particularly from the 1953, when the thermonuclear weapons were invented and being tested by both sides, the common assumption was this is how you should exist. We should maintain the appearance and credibility by telling everyone that we're ready to use these weapons. And that was the whole essence of the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, whoever is more credible. Well, unfortunately for Khrushchev, the United States and Eisenhower had more credibility because they had more weapons. Although, ironically, some Americans convinced themselves that they had the missile gap. Yeah. In reality, in 1961, this gap was kaput. The satellite intelligence learned for sure that the Soviets had how many? 1 to 16 fewer missiles capable of reaching the United States. So credibility already was punctured. And I think that to a certain extent, what caused that atmosphere of conformism, not only the usual Politburo stuff when the leader says yes, and everybody, of course, yes man, they all agree with him, but the kind of common acceptance among the military and among the Politburo that that's how you proceed. Nobody expected that this particular move would lead to a real war. But the previous crisis that Sergey mentioned, the Suez crisis and Iraqi crisis, the Kimoy-Matsu crisis, all those Cold War crises, created that kind of sequence of events that got people used to this. And that was really, really dangerous. So some people even say we should be thankful to the Cuban Missile Crisis that it happened and ended up in such a way that disabused both the military on both sides. Not entirely, by the way. We can talk more about the Soviet military continuing to believe in possibility of waging the nuclear war even after 1962. But I think the hawks among the U.S. military began to think differently rather quickly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But so did civilians.
Yeah, on the Soviet side, some did say, look, we showed them, we got the missiles out of Turkey, and we'll return to the denouement in a little bit. I don't want to skip ahead past some of these amazing revelations that you wrote about in your essay. We've already talked about the palm trees, and you talk about the series of mishaps that is triggered in June of 1962, when the decision is made to send the missiles to Cuba, pretty much everything goes wrong. Sergey, do you want to take us down a tour of all the mishaps here about the missile sites, the equipment, moving the men, the climate, the language barrier?
What we now have is a post-mortem on the Cuban Missile Crisis by one of the senior Soviet commanders in Cuba, a guy named Statsenko. He wrote this report right after the crisis, in which he basically described what happened, how they came to Cuba first, investigating, looking at the sites, finding out that the sites that were being recommended for deployment were not workable, but also discovering that they had to speak Spanish to the Cubans. And it was done for secrecy. They had to learn Spanish. I can just imagine how they had to learn Spanish, within a couple of weeks. But according to Statsenko, it worked. And then he talks about various other things that they had no idea about. For example, they did not know that this was the hurricane season in Cuba, and it would be raining, and you could not be constructing missile sites amid pouring rain. So they were facing that problem. Then they had this problem of where to put soldiers, the troops that were supposed to be there as a part of the whole missile division. The original idea was to place them in dugouts, but they discovered they could not dig the dugouts because the soil was sort of basaltic soil that just would not allow, or it was the kind of hard soil that would not allow itself, would not yield to digging. Even some things like equipment. They had no idea that the Cuban electricity system was running on a U.S. standard, and so their equipment that they brought with them would not work.
The climate, right? They didn't realize how hot it was and how you can't maintain it. The humidity.
Humidity, that there would be all kinds of problems with equipment because of that. Lack of communications, roads, all of that became huge problems. It is actually remarkable, as we point out in our article, it is remarkable that they were able to pull it off in the end.
In the end, they moved all those people and equipment across the ocean.
Well, and then, of course, they did not entirely pull it off, because once Kennedy declared quarantine, i.e. blockade, some of the equipment, some of the missiles were turned away, and then they had to cannibalize parts of the missiles in order to actually assemble at least some of the missiles to be launched against the United States. But all of that is just merely to emphasize how unprepared the Soviet military were for something like this. And in his report, Statsenko talks about this as well. Next time we have to be, we have to be better prepared. That's actually one of the interesting conclusions from all these documents that were released. The Soviet military were working through the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The big lesson that they discovered was that the next time we'll have to do it better. We'll have to do it better. Of course, the next time, thankfully never came, but it just serves to show how that the military are there to wage wars, and they were drawing their own consequences, their own ideas from the crisis.
And a plane full of Soviet officers couldn't make it to Cuba. It had to make an emergency landing or whatever on a different island, and American tourists are taking pictures of them. In the Bahamas. Yet, despite all of this, Vlad, it took until October for the United States to figure out what was going on.
Well, today it would have been impossible. We know that. Nothing can be hidden, nothing can be concealed. It's like, all cameras above you at any point of your life, whatever you do. But back in 1961, 62, there were still opportunities to pull off this trick. And in part, I think the CIA leader, McCone, suspected that the Soviets might do this, but he was the only skeptic. And he was counterintuitive, actually, because most of the experts are in part bureaucrats, and bureaucrats are very poor at predicting something unpredictable. They follow the previous patterns. So the Soviets never deployed a full missile division before. There was one minor exception in 1959-60 in the GDR, but that was relatively easy, and they did it in secrecy, and they removed it in secrecy. But to move the entire missile division from West Ukraine to Cuba, that was considered utterly impossible. And I think in part it was bureaucratic inertia. In part it was, we would not have done it. Why they were doing it. It's also, I should add, a cultural factor that I encountered even when I met with some high up Americans during that famous conference on the Cuban Missile Crisis in Cuba in 2002. And all of them were full of disdain of Castro and the Cuban regime regime. Understandably, it was a thorn in the side of the United States for many, many years. But back in 61, 62, they thought, to risk a nuclear war for such a miserable puppet regime just didn't fit into American imagination why Khrushchev would go to such a risk.
And there's a great line in the movie Dr. Strangelove, where Dr. Strangelove is asking the Russian ambassador in the war room, if you wanted this to be a deterrent, talking about the doomsday machine in the movie, if you wanted this to be a deterrent, why didn't you announce it to the world?
Is that the whole point of the doomsday machine is lost? If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
So let me ask you about Khrushchev here. If he thought this was going to be a deterrent, why did he try to move a nuclear division, as you described it, in secret to Cuba?
This was supposed to be announced at the party Congress, right?
You've watched the movie. Okay, good.
Of course.
Yeah. It was to be announced at the party Congress on Monday. As you know, the Premier loves surprises.
The reality is that he thought that he would announce it. I mean, this is a bizarre thing because in many ways, really, if he had announced the defense agreement with the Cubans to the entire world, you wonder what the United States would have done, because after all, it was a legitimate thing to do. I mean, the United States was doing the same thing with the Turks and with the Italians and so on. So it is interesting. I think what he was expecting was that he would move everything and then announce it, maybe after the American election, which was scheduled for November 1962. Again, as Vlad was saying, a fixation in his head. He just didn't think through all the alternatives, and nobody told him. At the Presidium, which was the forum for discussing this, the Politburo, when they were discussing this question, Khrushchev would kind of throw out these ideas, and nobody really questioned any of this, except for maybe Mikoyan. Mikoyan would always say, but what about this? But even on this, Mikoyan did not say anything.
Wow. So once the Americans, and it took several days after the missile's arrival, or no, let me take that back. It was several days after the U-2 spy plane noticed the equipment and the missile sites when Kennedy delivers the news to the American public.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
So about a week goes by, and the administration was able to keep it secret. The XCOM meetings show that right from the beginning, there were some hawks among that group of Kennedy advisors who wanted to attack Cuba immediately. And that's maybe where we could have triggered a catastrophe. Is that your view?
Well, absolutely. We have full documentation. Unlike the patchy Soviet documentation, we have the full records of what was discussed, and what indeed is striking. The first impulse was to attack and take out those missiles as an existential threat to the United States. One thing that comes to mind immediately, on both sides, all of those military who participated in the discussion on the US side or were yes men on the Soviet side, supporting Khrushchev, they were veterans of World War II. And a great deal of their reactions, a great deal of their military culture comes from World War II. I mean, what would you do in response to Pearl Harbor? You get shit out of them. You just deliver a maximum strike. You remove this danger. It's sort of like equivalent to an attack on America, because Cuba was sort of like an unfulfilled American state. It could have become America, but for some reason it didn't. And it was treated by Americans as almost part of their body. Very strange attitude, very ambivalent attitude.
It had just been a couple of years prior where the U.S. backed...
absolutely. Yeah. They wanted to return Cuba to the bosom of Mother United States, very much.
The Batista regime is what I was trying to say, yeah.
Batista was our son of the beach, so
Yes.
suddenly there was their son of the beach over there, Castro. And the American attitude was not surprising to me. It is surprising to us because we are children of the Cuban Missile Crisis and grandchildren, of course, of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the Cuban Missile Crisis made this kind of red line drawn across the nuclear history of confrontations, after which people began to think differently. And the whole system of coordinates changed. But before that system was, you have it, you fight, you use your weaponry. And we wrote in our article that had Kennedy known for sure that at that time, practically none of the three detachments of the Soviet missile divisions were combat ready or ready for launch. It would have been very hard for Kennedy to say no to those who suggested the lightning strike. Absolutely. Probably even impossible to say no to them.
But the Kennedy folks didn't realize how many Soviet troops were on Cuba when they were talking about this, at least in the beginning of the ex-com meetings. Eventually, they come around to the negotiated settlements. We'll get there. What's your take on, both of you can answer this, your take on that possibility that, the Hawks, let's go get them, let's wipe them out? Well, as you pointed out, those missiles actually weren't combat ready, but there were still a lot of Soviet troops in Cuba who would have been hit by the attack.
And they expected this attack. Sergey, may continue. I just would say one thing. All the documents tell us that they were ready to prepare for the attack. They waited for this attack, and they were ready to die. And you read the biographies of all the officers in Cuba, and where did their battle experience start? With Germans in 41, Stalingrad 42, 43. I mean, those were special combat trained people who were prepared, inculcated the idea of sacrifice for the motherland. And in this case, not for the motherland, but for the international movement. They were so-called internationalists who were prepared to die in the battle against American imperialism. And I think many of them really were ready.
Well, one thing that gave me pause, and I completely agree with you, Vlad, here, but one thing that gave me pause in the document was to read in Statsenko's report that precisely that if an order came to fight or to start a nuclear war or whatnot, they would have done it. He says we were prepared, we were ready to carry out the orders of the Soviet government without questioning. And the reason that gives me pause is that sometimes you hear this sort of thing about Soviet or sometimes even the Russian military today as but they'll see an order coming in from above and they will say, oh no, this is criminal, we're not going to carry it out. We don't see this in the documents, right? What we see is willingness to go and sacrifice themselves, even that means the end of civilization as we know it. But Martin, to go back to your question about what would have happened if the Americans decided to invade with a full force, not just try to take out missiles, which they could have done with airstrikes, but also actually invade with full force. It could have been very, very nasty because the Americans, of course, did not know that the Soviets had tactical nuclear weapons on the island. And there's an interesting element that has bewildered historians for a long time, and it has to do with the decision to use those weapons.
That's right. Command and control, right?
Command and control. We know for a fact that the strategic missiles on the island, i.e. the R-12s, where Pliev, commander in charge, would have to get authorization from Moscow to use those against targets in the United States. But there were also all kinds of other tactical nuclear weapons. And Khrushchev, once he realized that there would be, quarantine, et cetera, he issued an order: do not use any of those weapons. Do not use any of those weapons. But the key interesting bit, and this is, of course, October 22nd, the key interesting bit is what would have happened if the Americans invaded beforehand and not announced the invasion, not letting Khrushchev know. And there's ambiguity about what this would mean. And there's certainly a possibility that if Pliev and the Soviet forces on the island found themselves under American attack, that they would actually be using tactical nuclear weapons to repel American invasion.
And as you say at the end of your essay, if such voices had prevailed in 1962, we'd all be dead now.
We'll probably be dead in the long term anyways, they say. But
yes. Shouldn't be laughing about nuclear war, but Dr. Strangelove is my favorite movie. So let's talk about then how Khrushchev pulls back from the brink, as you put it in your essay, as he peered uneasily over the brink of nuclear apocalypse. Khrushchev found time to act as a mediator in the month-long Sino-Indian War, which took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he said something here really telling. History tells us that in order to stop a conflict, one should begin not by exploring the reasons why it happened, but by pursuing a ceasefire. And he was referring to this other conflict that was going on, but it could have applied to his own situation, right? So he becomes terrified by what's going on, and Vlad, he then decides that, okay, it's time to back out of this mess. Now, no one had died yet. No bullets had been fired. No blood had been spilled. So the comparison to what's going on today in Ukraine isn't perfect, right? But at least he was willing to pull back and maybe even lose face. I mean, how do you interpret this Khrushchev turnabout?
There are already some bodies, of course, and corpses. And one of them was a U-2 pilot, Rudolf Anderson, who was shot down, and he had a family in New York and 2 children. So they were casualties, but not to compare, of course, to what is happening today. I think we all stress that Khrushchev was a gambler, but Khrushchev was not like a 100% gambler. He was a much more complex individual. And returning to the theme of World War II, he was at Stalingrad in 1943. He knew how many millions could have died out of accidental start of something that he didn't mean to start. So
and he lost his son as well. He lost his son.
He lost people in the war, including his son. Exactly. So to portray him as just a gambler is a little bit monochrony way of approaching him. So he knew how to cut his losses. And he lost before. He had terrible humiliations before the Battle of Stalingrad. He was a commissar of the whole army, and Germans surrounded and basically took the whole army prisoner. And he could have been shot at that time for losing an army. Stalin spared his life. So he knew how to lose as well as how to bet in high gambling sort of manner. So we have to be thankful to him and not to the Soviet military in this case, not to the military in general, I would say, American or Soviet, for resolving the crisis. We should be thankful to Kennedy and Khrushchev. That is something that, again, is not exactly predictable. You could not predict, for instance, that Khrushchev, after all his ramblings, after betting so much, placing so much of his prestige, knowing what he knew about the Chinese watching him, the whole world watching him, that he would have suddenly said, let's just cut it. So, yes, Kennedy helped him. Yes, Kennedy offered him that deal to remove the missiles from Turkey. But Kennedy immediately asked him to keep this deal secret. So Khrushchev knew perfectly well he wouldn't be able to brag about this deal publicly. He would look like a loser, but he was prepared to take this. I don't think the current president of Russia is cut of the same cloth.
Yeah, great segue, because you write here, their prudence, referring to Kennedy and Khrushchev, holds lessons for today when so many commentators in Russia and in the West are calling for a resolute victory of one side or the other in Ukraine. Well, at least Khrushchev and Kennedy kept communication open. It was difficult to communicate at that time, not like today, where you can immediately call up a video conference, right? But there's really no communication between Putin and Zelensky, Putin and Biden. That's what scares me, among other things.
Well, we don't know. I would like to hope that there is some kind of back channel communication going on.
Yeah, I shouldn't sound too certain myself sitting here.
This is the responsible thing to do in the nuclear age. We are potentially in a nuclear confrontation, nuclear crisis with Russia. Therefore, maintaining back channel communication, whether it is, for example, between somebody like Putin's aide Ushakov and Jake Sullivan or Burns at the CIA, I think is probably essential. I think it's probably happening. So probably there's something happening that we're not aware of, and thanks God for that, or I would hope that it's happening. But you're exactly right, of course. It's very important to keep going.
Yeah.
Just to add, I heard also that there's some communications now, and I heard that there's the conflicting channels between the military. So we have to be now thankful to the military, in contrast to the Cuban Missile Crisis story, for being sane. And I think they're very sane on the American side. I hope they're saying on the Russian side, although I'm skeptical because in the process of writing this article, it kind of struck both of us how little the Cuban Missile Crisis was elaborated, discussed, learned from on the Soviet and the Russian side. In fact, all the files that we used that had been declassified only recently, they were not used by the military in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to decide what went wrong and so on and so forth. They were swept under the rug. And the usual story happened. I mean, Khrushchev was interested to present the outcome as a victory, his personal victory. He protected Cuba. The military were too guilty. The guy who spoke about the palm trees was pushed up to become the head of the general staff, good promotion. Then he died in an aerial accident, apparently an accident indeed. So, nobody was interested in sending this material to the military academy and slam it on the table and say, listen, guys, let's discuss and make it a showcase for our learning. So I'm not so optimistic about the Russian military. But, one last point about criminalizing the relations between the top leaders of the nuclear superpowers. This is something new that we're seeing. I mean, lots of public was absolutely happy to see Putin being picked by the Hague court. And the whole point is, oh, yeah, great, let's bring him to the Hague. That automatically makes it harder for any world leaders, including Biden, to call a war criminal. And yes, on one hand, justice should be served. Yeah. But on the other hand, do we want to keep communications between the leaders who have their fingers on the red button? Yeah. But that it should.
In order to find a way out of this war, just as a way had to be found out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's critical to understand motivations. So I've heard Putin referred to as a fascist, or he's motivated by Marxism-Leninism. He's trying to restore the USSR. He's trying to colonize Ukraine. Or no, he's really a Russian statist, or he's interested in restoring Russian state power. Where do you fall in this debate? What Putin's motivations are?
Well, let me start just, it can be, 30 minutes conversation, yes. And we don't have this time. So let me be extremely brief, and Sergey would follow on. I think he started as a statist. He didn't have any ideology. He belonged to the generation of the KGB officers that saw essentially the whole ideological construction falling down, collapsing. So it's safe to assume that he was a well-trained KGB officer who was disabused of any ideological ideas. But he knew, of course, that ideology was important, and he was trained to be a Russian nationalist, as many KGB officers had been. So gradually, from just a statist who hired technocrats and whoever to restore the greatness of the state, and he concentrated wealth of the state in his hands, he became someone who unfortunately lapsed to that very familiar mode of thinking about Russia. If you go all the way back, Russian philosophy was never great, actually, unlike in the West. But it was always a strange combination, I should say, of messianism, isolationism, and delusionary faith that there's a special mission of Russia, above all. So Putin, during COVID, people say, maybe even earlier, he began to read that sort of stuff, where he found ideas that, I cannot explain where else these ideas could have come from, but from the books written by people who are long dead. They belong to the pre-Marxist, pre-Leninist caste of Russian intellectuals who thought of Russia in terms of as an eternal rival of the West that should teach the West some kind of lesson. Yes, Russia always teaches some kind of lessons to the world, but all these lessons are wrong, unfortunately, as they see, but not in the eyes of Putin. Putin fervently believes today that he is on a mission. And this is, I repeat, it's highly unfortunate. Had he been just a cynical, disillusioned KGB colonel, as at the beginning, we would have been in an easier game with him.
On a mission, but does that mean he's not open to negotiations ever? Well, certainly not now. We're talking today as he gives his speech on the Soviet victory, the anniversary of the Soviet victory over the Nazis. Is he a rational state actor at all anymore, Sergey?
Well, look, this is someone who can change and has changed. I mentioned earlier that I've looked at Putin's speeches from early 2000s and find a lot of consistency with what he's saying now. But, this is a guy who could engage with the West at one point, but through a combination of factors, which Vlad described very well, has now become this person driven by bitterness, but also a sense of a mission to try to accomplish something that he himself perhaps may not fully grasp. What I have learned from history, and history is the only guide here because, I have no connection to Putin's inner brain. I have no idea exactly what he's thinking. But what we can see from history of Soviet Russian decision makers from the past is that often they are driven by rational considerations, but also very often by emotional considerations. We have already touched on that. Often they are driven by a combination of factors, which is why today I would say when people say that, Putin is driven just by Russian imperialism or something like that, my response to them, well, how do we know that? How do we know that there's not a combination of factors? Maybe he is reacting to some things that he perceives, amounts to some kind of, some grievances in relations with the West, whether it's NATO enlargement or God knows what. We don't know. There may be a combination of reasons that have combined to create this sort of approach to the world. He may not even be sure himself, which is the driving factor here, and what makes him so bitter after all.
Yeah, reasons that have accumulated over the past 30 years since the USSR's
30
collapse.
years, or even, since the time that he was in Dresden and he was looking at the collapse of the superpower that he felt he belonged to. So a lot of those things take years and decades to build up. Once they're built up, doors close, and it is very difficult. Indeed, I see it as extremely difficult now for Putin to back out of this mentality, of this worldview that he has created for himself and find a solution. However, we should not despair, because even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we had very little communication, we had two different systems like the Soviet Union and the United States, well, they were in the end able to work it out, and we avoided a nuclear war. Now, Vlad just said that actually maybe we were lucky because Khrushchev, of course, had experience of the Second World War, and Kennedy had experience of the Second World War. They knew what war was like, and this is not something that we can say of Putin today. But a part of me remains optimistic, and I still imagine in my mind that when given a choice between horrible catastrophe and the way out, any decision maker will take a way out, but we just can't be sure.
Well, one wonders why he hasn't seen the reality yet that his aims will not be accomplished in Ukraine. But if he and his ruling circle believe they can still win, well, that would explain it, however you might define winning. I didn't really phrase my question very well. I guess what I'm getting at is understanding motivations is critical, and what he's trying to accomplish there in Ukraine, right? If we're going to understand the timing of the war, why he decided in 2022 to invade Ukraine when he might have been able to do it easier in 2014, for instance, if you simply write him off as an irrational, genocidal imperialist, I'm not sure that helps us understand what's going on or how we might find a way out of this disaster.
Yeah, well, in 2014, he started the war. We all know what happened in Donbas.
That's right. I meant a full-scale invasion. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, a smaller scale, fuller scale. No one was prepared for a full-scale invasion in 2014, but the Ukrainian army was almost non-existent at the time, was much better prepared in 2022, among other things by the Western allies, by the Americans and the UK. And, why did he start it? I think he fits what you, Martin, described. He's not a one-dimensional raving Russian imperialist or someone who, like Hitler, to whom he's often compared, believes in his destiny and fate and Weltraum or, going to Valhalla after doing something terribly heroic. He's not that kind of guy. What he figured out wrongly in 2014, there were two things. He thought he would make a deal with whatever Ukrainian leader that would appear in Kiev through the combination of bribes, corruption, intimidation, other things. And he would strike a deal with the key Western partners of Kiev by saying, listen, it's just our own business between two of us. It's not a threat to world order. I don't want to threaten the world order. Something, I'm fantasizing now. But he was wrong, actually. Instead of Poroshenko, who did cut a deal with him, although Poroshenko didn't want to fulfill that deal of Minsk, he got Zelensky, whom he grossly underestimated. Zelensky was not only prone to acting like Churchill, something that came absolutely unexpected for everyone, but he was a tough man. He was a manager of a company, and according to all that is known about him, when he led this company, he was very, very tough. And he certainly behaved like that. Let's just imagine that another scenario out of many, instead of staying in Kiev, Zelensky would have run.
Yeah, that's interesting because Zelensky ran for president on a platform of trying to find an accommodation with Russia to end what was going on in the Donbas starting in 2014.
One thing that strikes me as extremely interesting here, and this is where it comes back to personalities. Personalities matter so much here. You look at Putin's relationship with Zelensky, and Vlad is right, absolutely, that he underestimated Zelensky. But here's something else. It seems that Putin simply could not accept that he was challenged like that somebody could basically refuse to accept him as the Tsar. How dare he act like this? Who is he? I'm here, the great Tsar, and this is just some kind of a
rookie, as we would say.
Yeah, well, entertainer, so to speak. So I would not underestimate this personal bitterness in Putin's character is driving him as a part of an effort to show Zelensky who was the boss. Well, I guess he got shown enough himself.
Sergey, Radchenko, and Vladislav Zubok, we are indebted to you for your expertise. On the next episode of History as It Happens, you may recall that in March we did a series on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. It's always been my intention to revisit that war throughout the year, not just drop in on the anniversary, but to revisit the key issues that we have to contend with, including the sanctions that preceded the invasion of 2003. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.